What kind of books did you like to read as a kid? Here are some of my favourites. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Classic. I also read this book in school called Holes, a fantastic mystery story. Diary of a Wimpy Kid? That always cracked me up. And my absolute favourites were the Unfortunate Events books by Lemony Snicket. They were dark, disturbing, and parents hated them. I thought they were awesome. But maybe you liked magazines instead? Or how about those classic Beano annuals? Or maybe some strategy guides to get you through your video games? Perhaps some TV books like Doctor Who? Or even some big movie novels. Or maybe... wait, I don't know where I have this, get that out of here. And of course, who can forget that classic tale, The Pagemaster? Wait a minute, this isn't a book, it's a film. Well, it's kind of a film based on books, which they ended up making a book about. Okay, let's start from the beginning of the story. Once upon a time, The Pagemaster was released in 1994 as a hybrid of both animation and live action, a bit like Osmosis Jones, only less disgusting. It seems it was intended to promote the wonders of reading by creating a world full of classic literary characters, but despite featuring some big names like Macaulay Culkin and Christopher Lloyd, it flopped like a wet book in the UK, opening at number 5 and grossing just under $1 million overall. Somehow, it was outdone by both Highlander 3 and Junior, which is pretty disturbing. But did I know any of this back then? Not a clue. I only know about this movie because, once again, it was repeated endlessly on Cartoon Theatre in the early 2000s. In fact, I actually own a tape of this movie that someone recorded off Cartoon Network, but they cut out all the adverts. Like, who does that? That's the best part. All that history, gone. Still, I have some fond memories about this movie. As a kid who loved to read, the thought of being sucked into all my favourite books was pretty appealing. I bought the novel from a school fete, and I even had the video game on the Sega Mega Drive. Yeah, I still have it. And let me tell you, I have so many fond memories to share about this game. Yeah, let's not go there. And isn't this all a bit weird? We have a game based on a movie based on books. Wow. Well, the game might be a nightmare, but the movie can't be all bad, right? So let's flip open the Pagemaster and curl up with a good book. I mean, film. Oh, never mind. This tape was released by the Cinema Club.
Welcome to Cinema Club, bringing you great movies at a great price.
Now, as a kid, I thought this was some kind of fancy movie club you had to join, but it was actually a budget range that put out a lot of older movies on the cheap. It's pretty weird that you could open up a family film like The Pagemaster, and on the inside cover, they'd be advertising horror movies like Hellraiser. What, were they sick in the head or something? That said, they kind of disguised being cheap by making their presentation very classy. Well, it would be classy, but the copyright warning has a grammar error. It is soundtrack? This is a movie all about books, and they couldn't even write a basic warning properly? There are so many movies in this promo, it's hard to know what to talk about. It's a throwback to the good old days, when actors took things seriously, and were never too over the top.
I will not!
Subtle.
Cinema Club. There's something for everyone.
There's also an ad for a board game called Let's Buy Hollywood, a game all about being rich and famous.
Fasten your seatbelts. In 1 hour, you'll control Hollywood in the board game the critics are saying is destined to become a classic.
Even though the game was sponsored by a charity aimed at helping homeless children. Kind of ironic, really.
Homeless and abandoned children and young people beg on our streets.
I mean, is this really the right tape for this kind of thing? It hardly puts me in the mood for a whimsical family film. They do it on purpose, I swear.
Call now to order direct.
On to the movie, and we start off with a pretty epic intro. Props to the late great James Horner for the soundtrack here. However, one thing that's not so epic is our hero, Richard Tyler, played by Macaulay Culkin. He's a kid who's scared of pretty much everything in the known universe, so the exact opposite of Kevin in Home Alone. Maybe the kid was trying to branch out into different roles, who knows.
I'm okay. No, I'm not!
Still, I can relate to this character a little bit. I mean, I was pretty scared of the dark too as a kid, but mostly because I thought evil demons would come to get me from under the bed. I was a very well-adjusted child. In the middle of a storm, Richard runs out of his room and overhears his parents talking about his problems, which, yeah, is a pretty lousy feeling at that age.
I signed him up for Little League. He drove everybody crazy with statistics about how he can develop tumors from being hit in the head with a ball.
Richard's father is played by Ed Begley Jr., who, for what it's worth, I think is a pretty good actor.
For what it's worth, I think you're an asshole.
Claire, he brought in a medical journal. Nobody wanted to play after that. And now I'm building him a tree house. In a tree he refuses to climb.
Dad isn't impressed with Richard's phobias and tries to get him to man up by building a treehouse with him.
Solid as a rock.
Dad, 8% of all household accidents involve ladders. Another 3% involve trees. We're looking at an 11% probability here.
Yeah, I think this kid's problem is reading too many books. But after Dad has a little accident, he asks Richard to go on an errand for him.
Go down to Gutman's hardware store, buy a pound of these.
Dad!
Son, you can't live your life based on statistics.
Personally, I'm with Richie here. I hated it when Dad asked me to do stuff. So Richard rides off on his giant Power Rangers bike to get some nails, but he ends up running into some 90s bullies. Oh, how I missed them.
Hey, Tyler! Where'd he go? In the mood?
Just look at these clowns. Even for 1994, these guys are dated.
Hey, what's the matter, you chicken?
Richard escapes through the woods, but apparently that storm is really out to get him, and he has to find shelter inside a spooky library. Again, relatable. Whenever it was raining in school, I'd always go hide in the library. I'd be lying if I said I didn't like the look of this place. Nothing says great atmosphere like a creepy library. But someone even creepier is the librarian, played by Christopher Lloyd, who might just be a little bit unhinged.
You're in need of a fantasy.
All I want is...
Adventure, of course. You're a boy who loves adventure.
No, that's not it.
I mean, the man's a complete nutcase. He feels like a live-action version of one of the villains from the Tom and Jerry movie.
It's horror for you, boy. I'm sure of it.
Still, it seems he put a fair bit of time into this role. After the movie, there's actually a behind-the-scenes documentary hosted by Christopher Lloyd. He shows us around the library and talks about how the movie was put together.
Today I'm here to tell you about a new movie that takes place in this wonderful world of books called The Pagemaster.
It's kind of amusing in a deranged sort of way.
I don't want any books. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I only came in here because of the storm.
In fact, if you want to talk books here, this whole setup reminds me of Goosebumps. Yeah, the scaredy cat kid, the 90s bullies, stormy weather, creepy library, the crazy old man who sends him on a dangerous adventure. It's pure R.L. Stine. No wonder I liked it. So the librarian gives Richard directions to find a phone to call his parents, even though there's clearly a phone right on his desk. There's your first sign this guy's out of his mind.
Don't be afraid, boy. If you lose your way, merely direct yourself back to the exit sign.
But in the middle of his search, Richard gets a little bit distracted by the attack of the early 90s CGI. To be fair, this is quite ambitious for the time. It has its own cheesy charm to me. Actually, it's kind of violent. I'm half surprised this evil paint dragon doesn't kill the kid. No, instead of meeting a colourful end, Richard is transformed into a cartoon, and this is where the animated portion takes over the movie.
I'm a cartoon.
You are an illustration.
It's pretty decent, and I like the art style of the library, even if the floor looks a bit like that special stage in Sonic 3. Richard is visited by the Pagemaster, also played by Christopher Lloyd, who I guess is meant to be like the master of all fiction.
Keeper of the books and guardian of the written word.
He looks like Dumbledore before Dumbledore even existed. He reveals that to get back home, Richard has to face his fears and find the exit.
You must face 3 tests: horror, adventure, and fantasy.
Richard is sent on his way, but he ends up crashing into a phone booth. Seriously, what kind of library has a phone booth? Richard is met by a talking book, Adventure, played by Patrick Stewart, making this surprisingly one of his less embarrassing voice roles.
You fiction and non-fiction.
Richard Tyler.
What kind of a book would that be?
Since Richard has a library card, Adventure offers to help Richard get home in exchange for checking him out of the library.
All I want to do is get out of here.
Of course you do, matey. We all do.
Adventure shows his generosity by opening a book and unleashing a giant squid on the library.
It's jump for your life!
How helpful. Richard ends up finding another book called Fantasy, voiced by Whoopi Goldberg, who thankfully isn't doing any ice puns this time.
Now I gotta straighten out my Little Mermaid underwear.
Please bring back the ice puns.
You gotta take me out of here!
The lads, with me!
He's Adventure.
I'll have you know, I'm a classic!
A classic misprint.
But since Adventure and Fantasy have some, tension between them, they argue over who gets to help Richard first. Adventure tries to prove how helpful he is by giving Richard another book. Okay, is he just trying to kill the kid now? He might as well be the villain. The gang escape into the horror section, and I like how the library is becoming more nebulous here. It's like its own inner world, with a big exit sign hanging over everything.
Looks like the only way to reach the exit is through that there house.
No way I'm going in there.
They head towards a haunted house, where we meet our third and final buck, Horror, played by Frank Welker, in a rare case where he isn't voicing some kind of grunting wild animal.
Oh, I scared you. I'm sorry.
He's a complete wimp who screams a lot, so yeah, pretty much my attitude towards the horror genre. The gang enter the haunted house and bump into a friendly scientist named Dr. Jekyll, none other than the classic literary character created by Robert Louis Stevenson in 1886. I'm telling you this because the movie sure doesn't.
Dr. Jekyll.
We don't learn why he's a scientist or who he is at all, really, which is a pretty bad sign for a movie that's meant to teach you a bit more about classic books. But at least he has the voice of Leonard Nimoy, so that's something.
I derive no pleasure in telling you that you are in extreme danger.
Dr. Jekyll is cooking up a sinister potion and offers the gang a drink. Yeah, the same thing happened to me when I spilled a can of Diet Coke once, but Dr. Jekyll is looking a bit hungover and transforms into a hideous monster.
My name is Mr. Hyde!
Ah! What a Looney Tune! So what do we learn about the infamous Mr. Hyde? Absolutely nothing. He just starts smashing up the place with a hammer. Like, what's going on here? It's just mindless.
Easy there!
Then a chandelier falls on him and he plummets to his death. What a waste of a character. So after that pointless interlude, the gang make their escape in a boat and sail off to the adventure section, where they run into Captain Ahab from Moby Dick, created by Herman Melville in 1851.
Did you see it?
See what?
The white whale. Moby Dick.
Instead of the actual character telling us why he's obsessed with hunting the whale, he just turns into a piece of nightmare fuel and everything becomes a sea of blood.
Our sea blows!
It does look kinda cool though.
He's possessed!
He's insane! He's my kind of guy.
I suppose this would be a good time to learn a bit more about this classic story, but nope, he's dead. That was what, a minute of screen time? How are we supposed to learn anything about these classic stories? Richard's boat gets smashed, and he ends up stranded on the high seas with Adventure.
You guys are the only friends I've ever had.
You've only known them for 5 minutes. Are we missing some deleted scenes here? The sharks close in on them, but they get rescued by a group of pirates. They seem very trustworthy to me. The pirates take them to their ship to meet with their captain, Long John Silver from Treasure Island, written by Robert Louis Stevenson in 1883. At least he gets a bit more screen time than some of the other literary characters.
You'll be joining our happy family as our new cabin boy.
Disney did it better. Silver captures Richard and Adventure and takes them to Treasure Island to dig up some, well, treasure. But his fellow pirates double-cross him, and just as they get ready to have a gory shootout, fantasy and horror come to the rescue.
I thought you two were goners.
How they survive being eaten by a giant whale is really beyond me.
Get the boat, boy. We're gonna be shoving off.
I'm not going with you. Yeah. Stay back.
Richard corners Silver, who manages to escape in a rowboat.
You be a hard lad, Richard Tyler.
Who are you? Why are you here? What is your story? This movie is just dumping literary characters on us without any explanation who they are. Like, here's John Silver. Bye. Here's Gulliver's Travels. Bye. Oh well, at least the skyline is pretty.
We'll never get to the exit now.
Honey, never say never around fantasy.
You know, I think that's why I liked this movie as a kid. It looks nice and has that vague travelling adventure feel, just without much substance. So Richard and the gang escape into our third and final area, the Fantasyland. But wait a minute, they were stuck on a tiny island in the middle of nowhere. How did they even get here? Oh, never mind. Now it's time for the award-winning song, because no animated movie from the 90s is complete without one.
Whatever you imagine is where your heart can go. There are worlds filled with treasure, time without measure.
Still, I am a sucker for cheesy 90s songs, so I really can't hate this, and some of the animation is pretty nice here, though what book the cheap glow stick people are from, I really have no idea. Richard and the gang head for the exit at the top of a cliff, but they still have one last problem to deal with, a ferocious giant dragon. I would make some kind of stupid joke about how to train your dragon, but that hadn't been written yet. They try to escape on a flying carpet, but the dragon blasts them out of the sky, and they end up stranded on the cliff. Alright, that's pretty funny. While the books hide for their lives in a cave, Richard does the selfless thing and abandons his new friends to reach the exit. Our hero. Still, at least it allows adventure and fantasy to take care of a little shipping business.
Be careful.
Ew, they're checking out.
How would you like to curl up with a good book?
But just as the dragon closes in, Richard finally decides to face his fears and take on the beast.
Hang on, guys! I'm coming!
This is probably the only time this character looks heroic. That James Horner soundtrack just sells it. So for all that bravery, Richard fights the dragon and immediately gets eaten. Nope, somehow Richard survives certain death and ends up in the dragon's stomach. Apparently, slow, painful digestion just doesn't exist in the world of literature.
Uh-oh. Look to the books. Look to the books.
With a little help from Jack and the Beanstalk, Richard climbs out of the dragon and reunites with his book buddies.
Master, you saved us. Glad you did, matey.
They finally reach the exit and meet once again with a Pagemaster, who gets quite a telling off from Richard.
He's the guy who did all this to me. I was nearly torn apart by a crazy doctor. I was made asleep by a bunch of mangy pirates. And eaten. Got that? Eaten.
Yeah, you tell him, honey.
If I had brought you here from the start, you never would have found the courage to face your own fears.
So I suppose the moral of this story is that it's okay to go through serious life-threatening trauma as long as it turns you brave by the end. Still, I do kind of like hearing Christopher Lloyd's voice here.
And in doing so, you triumph here and always.
Can we just get an hour of him giving moral advice or something? It's kind of comforting.
Hey, that's me.
That was you.
I'm ready to go home now.
Godspeed to you, boy!
So the Pagemaster finally sends Richard back to reality, and I suppose it's meant to be ambiguous whether it was all a dream or not.
Are you all right?
But if the books came with him, I guess it really did happen.
Here.
I'm afraid you can only check out 2.
Horror? I promised him. Just this once?
Just this once.
And does that mean the librarian really is the Pagemaster? Does he have some kind of magical power to turn people into cartoons? Why is he giving me that creepy look? There are so many questions here that still need answering. So Richard is now the bravest boy in town and proves it with perhaps the most epic barrel jump ever put to film. Thanks, James Horner. That night, his parents come home to find Richard asleep in the treehouse, with the books now free at last.
Let's let him sleep up here tonight.
It's all very sweet, and it almost makes me forget that we learned absolutely nothing about classic literature.
You know what would make this a happy ending? A kiss. I meant from her!
So that was The Pagemaster, and while it's not terrible, it's a bit thin on the ground. I think the library stuff is pretty cool. Christopher Lloyd is a lot of fun, the soundtrack is great, and there's a lot of merit to the animation. But I think the problems lie mainly with the story here. You don't really learn anything about any of the literary characters, and the movie is so short at just over an hour, I wonder if they just deleted a bunch of scenes that would have explained a bit more about who they are and why they're significant. Maybe it would have been better if they changed the Richard character to be a kid who hated reading, and he had to learn more about these classic stories in order to get back home, instead of a generic story about facing his fears. It might have added a bit more substance to the whole plot. Still, as it is, it's kind of a harmless movie. It's another one of those time capsules. It sucks me back to a time before I was born, and has kind of a nostalgic feel, so I can't hate it too much. Or maybe I'm just going too soft, you decide. But with all that said, the story is over, and it's time to close the book on The Pagemaster. The end.